Okay, so let's establish some facts. Most people know that the Bible is composed of the Old Testament and the New Testament. As far as research tells us, some of the earliest Old Testament writings were written around 1200 BCE, and the New Testament writings were written between the years 45 and 100 or so. So, when exactly do we have our first Bible? History tells us that it was likely around the 4th century. This was the first time when all these writings were collected and then translated to the Greek language in order to be compiled and shared as one book. However, it's important to note that the general population didn't have access to the Bible until about the 15th century or so. And it wasn't until the 18th century where we see the rise of seminaries and universities that make pastoral training institutionalized. Here's a question. Have you ever wondered how a person becomes a pastor? Um, or what makes a pastor a pastor? Uh, at the very least, they need to have a much deeper understanding of the Bible, right? Uh, they need to have good knowledge of the cultural and social context of the biblical stories. They also need to have a basic understanding of certain Hebrew and Greek phrases and words. These are just some of the basic things that a person is supposed to learn in order to be considered a pastor. But who do you think authors and produces the necessary academic literature that a person needs to read in order to become a pastor? Would it be other pastors? No, 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 no. With everything that pastors have going on, do you think they have enough time to administrate a church and do the necessary research and writing in order to author theological literature that can obtain community recognition, scholarly validation, and religious authority? No, I don't think so. So then, who does all this theological research and organizes it in such a way that if you read enough of it, it can transform you into a pastor? Well, that would be biblical scholars. Mm. These are not individuals that read and study the Bible in modern translations and interpretations. These are individuals that analyze the Bible in its original language, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic. So they kind of have to be fluent in these languages. These are not individuals who simply research and explore historical context according to the biblical stories. They look at all the cultural, political, and religious background of these time periods. Typically, these are not individuals that you will find in churches giving Bible studies. These are individuals that have their PhDs and they teach in universities and seminaries. Some of them work in biblical translation organizations, and sometimes they work in museums or other archaeological projects in order to analyze artifacts and inscriptions. Now, before I continue, let me be very clear. All right. Uh, by sharing this, I don't intend to minimize a pastor's profession or calling. Becoming a pastor still requires years of reading and studying. However, it's important to recognize that academically, there are people that are simply levels above a pastor. All right. Uh, so, why do I share all of this? Well, it might be different for you depending on who you are, depending on the church you're in. Uh, Wherever you are, you might typically see a person pastoring a church who is maybe as young as 30 years or maybe as old as 60 years. Uh, but for a better understanding, let's say that your church has a 30-year-old pastor. In my area and in my old denomination, I was informed that in order for you to pastor a church, you needed a master's degree. If you had a bachelor's degree in theology, that wasn't enough. You needed your master's degree. And we usually take around 5 to 6 years to obtain your master's degree. So let's say that this 30-year-old pastor who's pastoring your church is fresh out of the seminary. Okay? So this means that he began his theological studies around 2019. Here's something to consider. All the academic and theological literature that this 30-year-old pastor read back in 2019, do you think is the same literature that a 50 or 60-year-old pastor read when they were in seminary? In order to make this point further, I want to read a comment made by a biblical scholar a few years ago. And please pay attention to this because I think it can change the way you see things. This person says, scholarship continually investigates and challenges status quo beliefs and overturns bad ideas and misunderstandings. But pastors and lay leaders do not have time to read quality journal articles or high-end commentaries, so they read popular level work to help the prep for a sermon. People writing popular level commentaries now were in graduate school 30 to 40 years ago, and they may not have kept on the cutting edge of academic biblical studies. You see, I don't think most people really consider or appreciate the fact that high level academic and theological literature takes years to compile and publish. These are not writings that are produced by simply reading the Bible and then reflecting on it. These are writings that take years of research and even more years to write and publish. All right? The person also says, I think the process takes a generation or two, maybe longer. For example, the new perspective on Paul exploded in the late 70s or early 80s, but it did not start making it into the commentaries until the later 80s. I'm thinking about Dunn's WBC, World Bible Commentary on Romans, NT, and New Testament. Wright's work on Paul was not really out there until the 90s and not fully formed until maybe 5 years ago. Just two examples. So it is 30 plus years before people writing commentaries on Romans and Galatians at the popular level start to pay much attention to the new perspective on Paul. But by now, people have moved on from the NPP into other areas of research. I think it's a bit tragic that this is the reality of theology. People whose jobs it is to truly analyze the biblical manuscripts and share their commentaries is a process that takes decades to become mainstream. Which makes me wonder what type of research contemporary biblical scholars are doing now that we will only hear about in 2040 or 2050. Here's something else to consider, according to the scholar. He says, most church leaders do not realize they are 20 or 30 years out of date. Unfortunately, some do not even care. Some pastors I know are happy with the same old resources they have always used, even if it is far out of date. I had a conversation with a local church pastor about a particular Hebrew word. He was trying to make some preachable point, and I told him his point was simply not true. He then cited Trench's Hebrew Synonyms, a classic text published in 1880, as evidence that he was correct about the point he was making. I simply told him we know way more about the Hebrew language today than a writer could possibly have known in 1880, or earlier, since Trench likely wrote that based on earlier than 1880 research. As good as it was 140 years ago, it cannot take into account the Dead Sea Scrolls or the rest of research into the Hebrew language of over the last 160 years, let alone everything scholarship has learned in terms of linguistics and how Hebrew relates to cognate language, etc. This pastor simply did not care. He had been preaching that point for his whole life, and he was not going to let facts deter him from continuing to make that point. So with this example, I'm not going to say that all pastors are like this, but we have to admit that there are pastors like this out there. And also, we are talking about pastors whose jobs it is to maintain a healthy knowledge of the Bible in order to be ready for questions. These are the same pastors that may base their answers according to something they've read and studied back in the seminary. Uh, these are pastors that, because it is their responsibility to administer one or two churches now, they no longer have time to keep up with contemporary biblical research. And this is a big disadvantage that pastors have, right? Now, think about your regular churchgoer, or we can even think about a church elder or a church leader. In other words, church people that also read the Bible daily, but they don't have time, they don't have the same time a pastor has because they have their regular jobs. These church leaders don't read the Bible in its original language. They read a version of the Bible written in some modern language that has been translated and interpreted hundreds of times. Most times, these church leaders don't understand the cultural, historical, and religious context of the time periods during which these stories take place. They read the stories and then attempt to assimilate them with their own modern cultural, historical, and religious background. Then these church leaders want to go to church and teach others a theological perspective based on their own interpretation. And because they're a church leader or a church elder, then and they read their translated Bibles every day, well, then they must know what they're talking about, right? Do you see why we have so many Christian denominations? If an educated pastor already studies the Bible with a big disadvantage, what makes you think a regular church leader is qualified enough to give Bible studies? Just think about that. Thanks for watching.